Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, it's one of Connecticut's most unusual former habitats. For about 100 years, a group of mixed-race individuals came together and they formed a village. Now, some have unfortunately over the years characterized the residents of Barkhamsted Lighthouse Village as misfits and outcasts. Now, they really started as a Romeo and Juliet type of tale, complete with a rebellious teenager, and then built this magical village in the middle of nowhere. In many ways, the story has now come full circle. Well, we have with us today to tell the amazing backstory Ken Fader. He's Professor Emeritus of Archaeology from Central Connecticut State University, and Ken's the man who led the archaeological team that did several digs at Barkhamsted Lighthouse over many years and conducted extensive research. He's going to be along in a moment with our story. This week's trivia question: a militia led by Connecticut natives during the Revolutionary War can be credited with paving the way for the creation of a place we today call Vermont. What was the name of that militia? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Part magical legend and part incredible reality. It's the fascinating story of a lost village in the northwest hills of historic Connecticut. The village is called Barkhamsted Lighthouse. Now, it was occupied for about 100 years by a group of people who definitely lived outside of society's norms. And everything about this village, how it began, how it got its name, makes for a wonderful story. This is not some Indiana Jones type of story where the gold ring at the end of the journey is some hugely valuable trinket. No, quite the contrary. This is a story of archaeologists who uncovered the incredible story of ordinary people. Well, some people would call them outcasts, but they carved out and eked out a living literally in the middle of nowhere in northwest Connecticut, and their descendants are still around. Now, it's not the type of story you would normally associate with Connecticut's well-off pedigree, but it's an unforgettable tale nonetheless. Here to tell us his tale is the head of the archaeological team, Ken Fader. He's Professor Emeritus of Archaeology at Central Connecticut State University. Now, Ken, before we get into what you actually did with your dig in the Barkhamsted area, I want to actually focus on you, the person, for a second, because I did some reading on you that indicated that you actually, as a child, had an interest in what some would term legendary figures like Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and all that. First of all, is that accurate? And if so, how did that shape you?
I think the deal is sometime during my teen years, I became interested in paranormal and psychic power and UFOs and Bigfoot and Atlantis. I think a lot of teenagers do. I ended up actually back then, I don't know if they have this now, like for $1, you could sign up for a book club and you get 4 books for $1. And then every month you'd get another series of options. You'd have to buy a number of books. And the 4 books that I chose for this club were all these kind of out there books. There was a book about ESP, a book called Morning of the Magicians, which was a very popular book. This book essentially said everything you know is wrong. And every chapter was a debunking of what normal traditional science knew about the world in the past. And I was super naive. I believed in ghosts, and I believed in Atlantis, and I believed in a whole bunch of other stuff. And so every chapter in the book, I read it and said, oh my gosh, science, they're all lying to us. It's all a conspiracy to keep the truth from us. But there was an entire chapter about archaeology. Specifically, this is before Eric von Däniken and Chariots of the Gods, and it was specifically about how cultures all over the world were affected by ancient aliens who landed from other planets, landed on Earth, and taught the Egyptians how to build pyramids, and taught the Maya how to make a calendar. The thing is, by the time I was reading that chapter, I was already really interested in archaeology, and so I knew something about those topics. And over again in that chapter, I saw, wow, that's not right. Well, that's not true. Wait, that contradicts everything I know about Egypt or about Mesoamerica or about Stonehenge. And it occurred to me after a while that the reason everything else seemed really plausible to me was I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about chemistry or biology or geology, but I knew about archaeology. And that's when I start off with an interest in all that stuff. But that was the book that gave me this sense of skepticism that, these are interesting claims, but they rise or fall on the basis of the evidence that's presented in support of those claims. And that's when I really became kind of an arch skeptic and a debunker that translated into my teaching a course when I got my teaching gig back in the late 1970s as a professor of anthropology at Central Connecticut State, then college, now university. And I actually introduced the course that was sort of a debunking of claims made about the human past that archaeologists really could say something about. And that included things like Stonehenge and the pyramids and ancient aliens and lost civilizations. That kind of is my calling card in archaeology. For most folks, if you say Ken Fader to most archaeologists, they'll go, oh, he's that archaeological frauds guy. And that's okay. I'm proud of that. In fact, that book, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, it started in 1990, and now 2025, it's going into its 11th edition at Oxford University Press. It also hooks me into this lighthouse story that we want to talk about today, because my first introduction to that was as, oh yeah, here's a myth. This is a legend about Northwest Connecticut. And that's what set me on this path to trying to figure out, well, is there any truth to this myth, to this legend?
So let's do exactly that. What was it that you had heard, and what was the myth and the legend?
Here's my embarrassing backstory, okay? So we were doing an archaeological survey in Peoples State Forest. That's in Barkhamsted, Connecticut, northwestern hills of Connecticut. This is in 1985. And that survey involved us digging lots of holes in the ground. We're not doing full-scale excavation at that point, and we're looking for any physical material evidence of people living in that area. We found about 25 or 30 sites in Peoples Forest. Most of those sites date to before European contact. While we were doing that, along one little ridge, we saw these very strange cellar holes. They did not look like colonial cellar holes. And so we dug some test holes. And in fact, we found artifacts. We found materials in those pits, 18th and 19th century artifacts that the colonists left behind. These were artifacts that all had their origins in Europe. We broke for lunch and we're sitting down by the side of East River Road, and we're talking about this. The archaeologists are always speculating. We're always wondering. And in the southern New England, there are, for example, encampments of freed African slaves or escaped African slaves. So there are a number of sites that represent folks who escaped the South, came north. Ultimately, their goal was Canada, where they couldn't be recovered. But if you were in New York, if you were in Connecticut, you probably were far enough away to be safe, and they established communities. What we wondered is maybe we had found one of those. There is another legend in the Northwest Hills of Connecticut about Satan's Kingdom Gang. And these were turnpike robbers. Route 44, the old Albany Turnpike, that was a stagecoach road in the 1700s and 1800s. And apparently there were these bad guys who lived along the edge of the Farmington River, who every once in a while would come down out of the hills, attack stagecoaches, steal stuff, and run away. We think of stagecoaches and robbery as being kind of a southwestern thing. We had that in Connecticut. Nobody's ever shown where those robbers lived. And we thought, well, maybe we've got like this strange, like Sundance Kid and the Hole in the Wall gang. Maybe we have found something like that. So we're talking about that. And one of my diggers, one of my kids, walked across the little road we had crossed, and he's staring at a boulder on the side of the road. And I wondered, what is he doing? And he yells out to me, he says, Kenny, is this important? And I go, what are you looking at? He says, well, come over here. And I walked over, and in the boulder on the side of the road, there was a plaque. And the plaque said, this part of Peoples State Forest was donated by the Connecticut Daughters of the American Revolution. That's 1929. And near this spot was the site of an Indian village. And I thought, maybe that's important. Yeah, I better check that out. So I had no idea there was anything there. In the first place, we found it. A sign seems to indicate that it was an Indian village, but it would have to be 18th or 19th century. So I go into town and I tell people, yeah, we're the excavators. We're up on the side of Ragged Mountain in People's Forest. And we found this community, this old community with foundations. And we saw this sign about an Indian village. And people in Barkhamsted immediately said, oh, yeah, that's the lighthouse. Now I'm perplexed because Barkhamsted is like 60 miles from the coast. What kind of lighthouse are you going to have 60 miles from the coast? And I said, how is it a lighthouse? They go, oh, no. It just was called that. It's not an actual lighthouse. But if you want to know about it, go to the library and get out a copy of the book called The Legend of Barkhamsted Lighthouse by Lewis Mills. I recognize the Lewis Mills name because the high school in Burlington is named is Lewis Mills. And I find out he was a Connecticut educator. He was a superintendent here in the northwest part of Connecticut, and he gets this high school named after him. Well, I opened the book. My first reaction is, oh, well, this is easy. It's only like 145 pages long, so I'll whip right through it. And I started reading it, and, my negative reaction was based on the fact that the entire book was a poem. If anybody listening is familiar with the old Longfellow's Hiawatha, by the shores of Gitche Gumee, was in the forest, and on and on and on. It was the same kind of rhythm to by the side of Ragged Mountain in the town of Far Barkhamstead was a village dwelt in by a people blended, partly Indian, partly white. And I go, what? I figured, well, it sounds like an interesting story. And I read through the whole thing. And it told this amazing story that I had never heard of. Now, remember, the title says The Legend of Barkhamsted Lighthouse. So now I want to know, is this story true? The story that Lewis Mills told was of a young white woman of European ancestry, whose name was Molly Barber. Given name was Mary, but everybody called her Molly. And she lived in Wethersfield, Connecticut. And her father, Peter Barber, was like the richest guy in Wethersfield. And she was already a little bit older than her peers who were getting married, and mostly because her father apparently didn't find any of her suitors were good enough for her. And in the poem, this is Lewis Mills making this up because he wasn't there, she threatens her father that, cross me now and I will marry. He who next shall seek my hand, be he white or any color. And that's a pretty big deal back in the 1740s, 1750s, 1760s, when this is supposed to have taken place. And sure enough, a young Narragansett Indian man whose name is James Chogum, and the Chogum name shows up on Block Island. We know that's Narragansett. Well, this young man traveling up the Connecticut River gets a job at the Peter Barber estate. And apparently, he finds out about Molly's threat to marry whoever is going to ask her hand, even if he's not a white guy. And according to Mills, he says, hey, listen, I'll marry you. And Molly says, okay. And then absconds into the Northwest Hills to get away from her father. According to Mills, this James and Molly stop in Canton, Connecticut, northwest part of Connecticut, and they find a place of refuge there, of sanctuary, in a Native American village whose Shechem, the chief, the leader, Chief Cherry. And they ask for sanctuary, he gives it, and they live there, according to the poem, for like a month. In a month's time, Molly has completely changed what she looks like. She's wearing the dress of the Native women. She has darkened her hair so she doesn't stand out as a light-haired white woman living with a bunch of Native Americans because she's afraid of her father. And sure enough, according to Mills, a posse enters the village looking for the white woman. They look right at her, but because she now has so transformed herself, they don't recognize her. They leave. There's a big bounty for her. At that point, James and Molly figure they better get even further away from the clutches of her father. They travel up the Farmington River. They find a place in what is today Barkhamsted, on the side of what is today called Ragged Mountain, and they decide this is where we will make our stand. They build a little house, and they decide that that's where they're going to live out their lives.
Let me just jump in here for 1 second. I want you to try to explain to people just how remote this area is.
Whenever I give talks about this, I do say, well, back then, Barkhamsted was the middle of nowhere, and nothing has changed. It still is kind of the middle of nowhere. You got to figure that Barkhamsted at that point did not have any white settlement. There were scattered villages of native people, of Native Americans. Even once the stagecoach roads are brought in, we're talking about like a day's worth of travel from Hartford to Barkhamsted. That is a long and tedious trip on a barely passable stagecoach road. So it was incredibly isolated. If you want to hide, if you want to disappear, Barkhamsted, Norfolk, Winchester, these are the places you want to go. Because even today, with a paved Route 44, it's a long trip to get into Hartford. So back then, yeah, this is very isolated. It was a very smart thing for Molly and James to do if they wanted to disappear. And they were successful at that for some time.
When you go up to Barkhamsted today, of course, there's the beautiful Barkhamsted Reservoir, which, of course, didn't exist back in those days. And it really was, as all development occurred, along the river. The west branch of the Farmington River came up through there, and there was, a terrace on Ragged Mountain where they found a place to locate?
As an archaeologist looking for archaeological sites, doing surveys, one of the things we look for is an expanse of flat ground, especially in the Northwestern Hills. It's very hilly. And nobody's going to want to put a village where there's a steep slope and you can't build a foundation because everything is so steeply sloped. You need some flat area. And I'm sure as they traveled by canoe up the Farmington River, they stopped, they looked around, they said, okay, there's nowhere right here where we could have a farm, plow some land. It's too hilly, it's too rocky. But at this point, along that Farmington River on what is today East River Road, when you leave that road and you go up a little bit of a steep slope, it's very flat. And then beyond that is the mountain. So it's kind of protected. It's a very convenient place, and there's plenty of fresh water. So it's a convenient place. When we look for archaeological sites, we try to put ourselves in the position of the people who settled the area. Just on the river itself, right there, there's a little bit of an island with great agricultural land. And in fact, in the documents, that island was called James Chogham's Plowland. So just like every town in Connecticut has records of what land is being used for what, Campston was doing the same thing. They kept track of, for tax purposes, what land was being used for what purpose and determined their taxation on that basis. And so sure enough, you look through those records today from the late 1700s, early 1800s, and you find that that's James Chogham's Plowland. And I'm sure that factored into why James and Molly selected that isolated spot to establish a community.
So now when you talk about James and Molly, okay, they went up to this area. What becomes very intriguing is not too long after that, in the 1740s, thereabouts, they start to have children. I guess they had 8 children, if I understand it right, and maybe some others came to visit. And tell me how this whole village, this Lighthouse Village, developed.
Yes, they began having kids. 7 of those children lived to adulthood, and then 6 of those children marry. As people are walking through this area, they're native people, they're hunting. And in the 1770s, you have Europeans moving into the area as well. And so the people become aware of this little family up on the top of the hill. As James and Molly's kids grow, people do move into the village and marry into the family. So we have people of African descent, of European descent, other native people. So it starts as a couple running away from her father, becomes a big family, and then what becomes a big family becomes a village as other people begin moving in. And so you have this kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial community. And those children of James and Molly, they have kids of their own. And so there are grandchildren and great-grandchildren all forming this community in Barkhamsted in the middle of nowhere. But it becomes less the middle of nowhere when that road that today is East River Road, that is improved for stagecoach travel.
So let's jump into that, because that's key, right? This is how the village actually ended up getting its name. And if you could explain what that whole part of the story is about, that'd be great.
When I saw this in the Lewis Mills book, I thought, well, maybe he's making that up. But you know what? You can find newspaper articles from the late 1700s that tell exactly the same story. Once that stagecoach road, and these are private roads, so these are toll roads. You have to pay a toll to go on it. And this East River Road becomes the Farmington River Turnpike. So as stagecoaches, many of them coming from Albany, and their ultimate destination is either Hartford or even Boston, this is a little shortcut for them to take, and then it reconnects to the Albany Turnpike, which today is Route 44. And the story is that it was the stagecoach drivers coming from Albany who take this Farmington River Turnpike cutoff. They don't have maps. They don't have any way of knowing where they are. And it's this boundless woods, right? With very little sign of settlement. That when they got to the side of the village, the home fires are burning and smoke is coming up from the chimneys in the fall and in the winter. Then it's those stagecoach drivers who began calling the place their lighthouse. And the reason for that is, in a sense, the village served as a lighthouse, as a beacon for them. It was the first sign of civilization that they saw on their way from Albany, and they would say, oh, there's our lighthouse, 5 miles till port. And at that point, port was the town of New Hartford, because in New Hartford, there's an inn, there's a place to water your horses, there's a place to stop and rest before the 25 more miles it was going to take to get to Hartford, where a lot of those folks were aiming for.
Now, Ken, if I have my research done correctly, you were doing digs on this site for roughly a quarter century, from the mid-1980s up to almost 2010. Do I have that right?
Here's my story about that. So when we found the site in 85, this is a great place. I have to go back. I have to investigate the legend. The next few years, we were doing a lot of other projects. So it really wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that I decided, okay, now we're actually going to be able to excavate the lighthouse site. One of the reasons that I became even more kind of obsessed about the site was because I learned a valuable lesson. As an archaeologist, all the work I had done previously was to satisfy my curiosity. And that's how the lighthouse project started. I'm curious about this. I've got students. I have some funding. We're going to dig this site. The first year we were there, we had been on some local news broadcasts in Hartford. And so it was, a human interest story. Archaeologists are excavating the cool story of the lighthouse. The next day, we were back at the site, and we had broken for lunch, and we were down on the side of the road. While we're sitting there, this old pickup truck drives up. A gentleman comes out, middle-aged guy, kind of a big guy, big burly guy, wearing a T-shirt and baseball cap. And he's got a black dog in the truck, and he says, "Rag, sit." And I'm sitting on the ground. I don't know this guy from Adam, but, there are people fishing on the side of the road there all the time. So no big deal. But he comes right up to me, and he's kind of looming over me with his hands on his hips, and he's kind of glaring at me. And I'm thinking, oh, my God, do I owe this guy money? And so I stood up, introduced myself. I said, yeah, but can I help you? He glared at me for a little while longer. And then big smile, he thrust out his big hand, and he said, "Shake my hand." And of course I did, okay. And then big smile, he put his hand on my shoulder, and he pointed up to the terrace, up to the hill, and he said, "You just shook hands with one of them. I'm a descendant, 7th generation descendant of James Chogum and Molly Barber." Hugely exciting. The point of the story is, I asked him, I said, "Well, listen, would you like to come up? We can show you our digs." And he said, "Oh, yeah, I'd love to see that." And as we're going up, I asked him, "When's the last time you were up here?" Because he lived in the area. He said, "Oh, I've never been up here." And that surprised me. If your ancestors have an abandoned village, wouldn't you visit it? I didn't say that. I just asked him politely, "Oh, how come you've never been up here?" And he got really quiet and serious. And what he said was, "Well, around here, it's kind of not a point of pride if you're a descendant of those drunken Indians up on the hill." And I felt terrible. Your family this is a wonderful story. It's an American story of grit and determination and survival. So I walked him around, and I showed him the various foundations. And then we got to the cemetery. There is a cemetery up there. Now, it doesn't look like a regular cemetery. There's no written epitaphs. These are just upright stones marking the locations of the graves of about 50 of the people who lived at the lighthouse. At that point, I had on my professor pants, I'm lecturing about the archaeology, and I'm telling them, oh, some of these are headstones and some of these are footstones. And I look up, and this big bear of a man has tears running down his cheeks. I'm very concerned that I've said something that I've offended him, and I apologize. Oh, Mr. Ellis, I'm so sorry if I've offended you. And he stopped me, put his hand up. He said, no, stop. He goes, I want to thank you for bringing me home. I almost tear up when I tell the story because I was naive and foolish not to know that this would have an emotional impact on the people who descended from James and Molly, who were ashamed of being descendants because people in town made fun of the Indians up on the hill. And I got to tell you, from that moment on, my work at the lighthouse became not so much about satisfying my curiosity, but about helping share the story using my skill set to help the descendants fill in the gaps in their own history.
Well, Ken Fader would go on to meet and befriend many other descendants of the Barkhamsted Lighthouse Village, the archaeological site which you can visit after a short hike in the People's Forest in Barkhamsted has been designated a state archaeological preserve. Now, that's similar to programs like the National and Connecticut Registers of Historic Places. The designation means that archaeologists have uncovered meaningful remains of Connecticut's past on the sites. And for the record, sites in the Archaeological Preserve program are almost always on state-owned land. Well, one thing's for certain in this particular case, as Ken said, and I can vouch for it after a visit myself to the remains of Barkhamsted Lighthouse Village, it remains out in the middle of nowhere. That's going to wrap up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Central Connecticut State University Professor Emeritus of Archaeology, Ken Fader. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, a militia led by Connecticut natives during the Revolutionary War can be credited with paving the way for the creation of a place we today call Vermont. What was the name of the militia? Well, the answer, of course, is the Green Mountain Boys. And it was started by Ethan Allen and continued by his cousin, Seth Warner, both Connecticut natives. Well, next week on Amazing Tales CT, the exploits of Ethan Allen's family and the rather underappreciated role that the Green Mountain Boys played in helping to win the Revolutionary War for the Patriots. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.